Your Excellency, the Bautista and the Pro Mexico Group, SBS, good morning all. I want to share probably more information than we have time to. So I understand you're going to receive copies of the slides after the event. So don't despair if I go a bit quickly. There is a lot to say about labor in Mexico, and I wanted to be sure that you have the information even if you can't cover it all here this morning. A few facts and figures about Mexico. As you can see, Mexico is at the moment over 100 million people. It's still growing at a very fast rate, more women than men. But a few things that you want to see on this slide. It's a very young population. It's still concentrated in the urban centers of Diez, Guadalajara, Monterrey, and now in the north in Tijuana, with a very high life expectancy and a very high GDP, which actually contrasts with a few of the misconceptions that there are about Mexico, which is why I call this presentation How to Break Some Myths about Mexico. One of the things I also wanted you to see in terms of where you have population, this is the one I wanted to see, is if you look at the male to female contrast, female being the red, the female population is actually growing in the manufacturing sector, which is one of the things I want you to see. The professionals and managers is actually a very large percentage. Some more information I want you to see. The unemployment rate is actually quite low, much lower than even in the U.S. today, with a very controlled rate of inflation, which was not the case probably 10 years back, but it's thanks to all the efforts of the government in Mexico, been controlled for the last decade or so, which means really that the debt has been controlled for the last decade or so. And what I want to say about this is very stable in terms of the economy and very stable in terms of labor. A few more things that you need to know. Between Brazil and Mexico, it's 54% of the Latin America population. Brazil is roughly now hitting 200 million. In Mexico, as we said, it's about half. But it is 2/3 of the GDP in the region between the two countries. Mexico taking an increasingly larger share, as His Excellency pointed out in his opening speech. It also has one of the lowest costs in the world, particularly if you want to penetrate the U.S. market. Manufacturing from China and shipping into the U.S. can be more costly than manufacturing in the north of Mexico and either railing or trucking across the border into the U.S. So this is an important consideration to make as you want to penetrate not just the Latin American markets, but the U.S. market, because the lower cost in Mexico, coupled with two other things that I think are important, is just very high productivity in terms of manufacturing. All these TVs that His Excellency is talking about and all these products that are being manufactured, telephones and so forth, is because there is a high degree of skilled labor particularly in the Maquiladora in the north of Mexico, that can produce very high quality at very low cost. 1 in 7 cars doesn't tell the full story because of the remaining cars, many of them are manufactured in Japan and in Europe. So out of the American cars, roughly I think it's 1 in 3 to 1 in 4 cars that are made in Mexico. And practically I read somewhere that almost all pickup trucks that travel in the U.S. are made somewhere in Mexico. As you can see, when you contrast Mexico to the rest of Latin America, the population is only about a fifth, but the share of exports is 42%. So clearly Mexico is where most of the operations of companies that want to export are being set up. If you're contemplating investing in Latin America, your second choice, or at least for the most part, people start looking at countries that we mentioned earlier, like Colombia, like Peru, or like Brazil. They're too far away. So the fact that Mexico is right next to the U.S. and Canada is really a big thing. There's another advantage of doing business in Mexico, which is the large population in Mexico itself, 100 million, and you saw that the average GDP per capita is actually quite high. Currently, the exchange rate is very favorable and stable, as we talk. The transportation costs across the border are also very low. The other point that I want to make here is, of course, the free trade agreements, and there are others that can speak to this better than I can. But Mexico not only has NAFTA that helps to deliver into the U.S. at a very favorable rate, it can also export into other countries in Latin America at favorable rates. There are some things, though, that you need to worry about when you do go to Mexico. There's high financing costs. It is higher than borrowing in other places in the world. The tax structure can be complicated because you have local tax and you have federal tax. You also have state tax. The labor law is very different than what you're accustomed to, particularly if you are a Singaporean company. The labor law can be complicated. It takes a little bit of time to understand it and traverse through it. And for the most part, you will need absolutely a Mexican head of HR to help you understand the intricacies of the labor code in Mexico. It's not as restrictive as others that you might know about in this part of the world. So those of you that are used to dealing in Southeast Asia and the complexity of dealing with labor codes, say in Indonesia, and you'll find that Mexico is actually a lot easier to understand. But it's not as easy as, say, the U.S. or Singapore. So you need to understand that. The law tends to be protective of employees. In that sense, perhaps more similar, again, if you're used to dealing in Southeast Asia, to what the Philippines has, which is the concept of acquired rights, which basically means you provided a benefit to an employee before you can take it back. You actually have to pay severance on it. So it's just intricacies that you have to deal with. I don't want to make it any bigger than it is. Not as complex as Indonesia, Vietnam, or other countries around here, but not as simple as Singapore. There is very good public education, which is another point that I think it's important to make, and that public education also allows for a couple of things that are important. Essentially, have a high degree of literacy, but not only that, there's a high degree of English-speaking people, particularly in the north of Mexico, as well as in the industrialized cities, which makes it very easy to do this. The Programa Nacional de Infraestructura, which basically has been in place for almost the last 5 years, has done a great deal of making Mexico even easier to traverse, particularly as it comes to highways and airports, but also in terms of energy. For those of you again in manufacturing that require energy for your manufacturing products, this is a relief to know that you have a steady source of relatively cheap energy for your manufacturing capacity. The next point I wanted to make is Mexico itself has become very profitable. The Bolsa in Mexico City has done tremendously well in the last few years. It is, as you can see in some of the numbers here, the direct investments that Francisco and His Excellency were mentioning are not only very high, but within the Bolsa itself, the investment in the exchange in Mexico has done very well. Part of it is the stability of the government, part of it is the stability of the currency, and the stability of the economy. As you get into the labor component here of what we need to know in terms of doing business or doing business with people in Mexico, a few things that are important to understand. One is the benefit programs. The benefit programs are in the main much more complicated because you have several layers of social benefits that you need to contend with. There is a Social Security plan that is Tier 1 that covers everybody, and that is mandatory. It's basically a Social Security tax in that sense. It also covers things like unemployment, health and safety, and occupational health. The second tier is employee plans. The employee plans also come in several flavors, but in the main, on the tier 1, there is a Mexico legislated pension plan that most companies will also supplement. So what you get is still something that we don't see here. Here, for instance, CPF basically is the top pension plan. The equivalent to CPF in Mexico is only the base, and most companies will supplement that. And they will supplement it usually with a DB plan or a hybrid DB-DC plan. That means that it will be a hybrid between a defined benefit plan and a defined contribution. For those of you that are not HR related, it's a hybrid between a savings plan and a true pension plan. Now, what most companies do in Mexico, you need to understand this as well, is they will supplement severance for age with this pension plan. In other words, because of the tax advantages of it, you will have to create a pension plan like this. Otherwise, age is not a reason for dismissing an employee. They can stay working for you a long time. So you create pension plans to make sure that you can basically let employees go and replace with younger employees. Then you see that there's also an individual type of plan. The STAR in Mexico has created a whole new idea of how to invest in Mexico. And now employees that have to basically manage their own funds. And then the CPF, you don't manage the CPF. You put your money, someone is managing it, you get a guaranteed return. You know how it works. In Mexico, you actually have the ability to move your investments from one place to the other, as it is, for instance, in the United States. So you're basically more responsible for your own funds. That has created a new generation of individuals that now have learned how to save and how to save in a more investment-savvy way. A few other things that we have in the labor law that are important to understand, just from an HR perspective. There is what's called the aguinaldo, which is a Christmas bonus. It's typically around 1 month of pay. It is capped. There is a vacation premium on top of the vacation, and that usually is about 2 weeks of pay. Holidays tend to be less than here. The normal, the legally mandated is actually a lot lower, but the standard is roughly 2 to 3 weeks per year. There is the concept also of PTU. PTU is basically profit sharing. It's mandated profit sharing. It has a formula. The formula is 10% of pre-tax profits that needs to be shared for all employees, and the rate of sharing is to do with the highest unionized or non-executive employees' rate of pay. That's assumed to be the rate of pay for everybody in sharing. Many companies, for tax or accounting reasons, decide that what they're going to do is 1 month pay for everybody across the board. So when you start adding up the compensation, in Mexico compensation, whereas here in Singapore we're used to 13 months, in Mexico you're more looking at around 15 months of pay as your pay compensation. There is also Seniority Premium. That Seniority Premium is an additional amount based on years of service. Other interesting things about the income tax law, in particular the company car. Company cars are in the main non-taxable, as long as they're assumed to be for work, but the definition of for work is actually broader than it is here. So you will see that when you go to Mexico, many companies provide company cars as benefit. In fact, I kid you not, the number one question a prospective employee will ask of his prospective employer is, what's my base salary? But the second question isn't, what's my bonus? The second question is, what's my car? We talked about different laws that you need to contend with. The Social Security is, again, the most prevalent. It applies to every employee in the country. It has retirement, death, and disability, both short and long term. It also has illness, maternity, which is actually not considered a disability or a release, and workers' comp is also part of the Social Security plan. However, the reason why most companies supplement Social Security is what you see on the bottom. Actually, the IMSSS is not in a good financial state. It's right now on a pay-as-you-go basis, which basically means that the services provided at IMSS hospitals in particular, although good, perhaps not at the level that you would need for executives and perhaps even for most of your employees. So, although there are no opt-out possibilities, you still have to pay the tax whether you use it or not. The reality is that most companies will supplement Social Security with their own health plans and life insurance plans and so forth. The severance and termination, it's actually a straightforward law in Mexico. You can fire anyone for any reason as long as you pay them. That's no different than some of the laws in our part of the world. The basic severance is 3 months plus 20 days per year of service. It is technically uncapped. There is a seniority premium, as we also discussed, which is 12 days of salary per year of service, but it's also capped. So it actually doesn't amount to that much, but only you receive this money if you stay with the company 15 years, which nowadays gets to be a smaller and smaller problem. It doesn't really supplement your pension, it doesn't supplement the IMSS pension, but it is an amount that you can. Oh, by the way, there's a whole concept of voluntary and involuntary for cause and not for cause. Technically, if someone is dismissed for cause, you are not liable for severance. But I want you to know that to demonstrate for cause is not a simple matter. It basically would have to be almost criminal, and the police would have to arrest you, and then you have cause. So I don't want you to get the idea that this is a simple, straightforward process. It isn't. Most people will dismiss as involuntary and negotiate the way out with severance. As I said, if you pay the 3 months plus the 20 days, you don't have to give a reason to anyone. That's it. Here's your money. Bye-bye. I don't even have to tell you why. The other thing I mentioned earlier is here, old age is not a cause for dismissal, which is why most companies will supplement their plan or create a pension plan that emulates severance, so that when people become at retirement age, you can basically tell them, here, take your money, I need somebody else to occupy that. We talked about different plans and different elements, of compensation in your plans. The basic salary, as we talked about, include all these other elements, which also include things we haven't talked about, like food vouchers, vales de despensa. These are important parts of compensation, even to executives, because they're tax-free. They are capped as well at about something like 2 weeks of pay per year, but they're still provided. We talked about the profit sharing as part of mandatory, so all this basically becomes part of your mandatory, including the savings. On the bonus side, there is the mandated profit sharing that you see here, but also most companies will have an additional incentive plan. In fact, the government of Mexico has been very explicit about having productivity bonuses in place in as many manufacturing companies as possible. They understand that productivity as well as quality are the two things that they must continuously emphasize in order to be and stay competitive against the Chinas and the Vietnams of this world. And that basically means that there is a lot of companies that will have a productivity-based bonus because the government also sees that in a good light. Some companies will also have long-term incentives, as it is the case here. However, the local Mexican companies tend to not do as much. They tend to be more like the local Chinese that don't like to dilute their shares. They much rather pay higher cash and higher bonuses. So the local Mexican companies tend to not provide too much long-term incentives, but the multinationals will. Then we talked about benefits, and the bigger point that I make, because all the other things basically look alike, the two bigger points I make is there is a retirement plan in addition to the Social Security plan, plus the company car. You must never forget that cars are tax advantageous. So when you look at a compensation component at a glance, and this is the sort of data that I want you to see later, you basically have to make up your compensation of all of these little things. It's not so straightforward as salary plus bonus, and you're done. You must have all of these things. And what this gives you is what is the statutory mandated portion, and this gives you what is the typical practice. For instance, Christmas bonus, mandated by law, is 15 days, but most companies give a full month. When you're done doing all of that, your typical compensation mix will look something like this. You see, at the general manager level, you will find, and let me just explain to you what this is. The blue is base salary. The gray is other fixed compensation that isn't base salary. The green is your base bonus. Your 4 would be your long-term incentives. Your benefits, and your 5 would be your long-term incentives. So, no, I'm actually getting this right. Your 4 would be your long-term incentives, your 5 would be your benefits. Now, as you can see, the proportion of benefits more or less between 8 and 12 across. You also see that the long-term part is very small on average in the country, but also that bonuses are actually very small compared to what we see here in Singapore. Here in Singapore, at a general manager level, you're probably looking at least a 40%. In many cases, it will be even 100%, as in 50-50 between base and bonus. In Mexico, as you see, the prevalence of variable pay is less. And this is remnants of the economic crisis in the 80s and the high inflation rates that Mexico went through back then. Back then, when you had inflation rates that exceeded 100%, you really didn't want a bonus. You wanted to pay today, you wanted to use that money today, go to the supermarket today, and spend that money today. Because tomorrow, that money was worth less. So the idea of a bonus sort of was, you're going to tell me that I've earned the money today, but you're going to pay me a year later. The money's worth, a tenth of what it is today. And so that's sort of a remnant of what we have there. This will give you, when you have a chance to see it, down here you'll see it in Mexican pesos, and then you'll see what we call MERCER decision classes, which is basically different parts, what the compensation rates are for the different levels of hierarchy. This basically tells you what is your Social Security payment, your new scheme, your old scheme, and the additional termination indemnity, as I told you that everybody has. So what you basically see is that at some point you will need this much after-tax income, and you should lock in the amount that you need. So that's why most companies will create an additional pension plan to cover that shortfall. The next slide basically covers that. I told you also that the savings are just starting in Mexico. It's not something that ever happened. Again, back to the idea of the 80s and high inflation. Why would you want to save? It was easier to spend the money and have the goods that you need today. So it actually doesn't have a big culture of saving. And this is why the STAR was created, to put more savings into the banks. We've talked about public and private, both health and disability, and made the point already that although the Social Security system is prevalent throughout all of Mexico, the quality is not perhaps what you would like for your executives, so there's private supplemental health plan for just about all levels of employees. This basically shows you what the prevalence is of that. So life insurance, supplemental life insurance, supplemental total and permanent disability, supplemental major medical, all of these are basically expensive in Mexico. There is also a few instances that you'll see of additional issues that you need to cover. You see that a lot of minor medical expenses are covered, as well as dental and vision, which is also fairly common in Mexico. Now, what are the issues that we see? We see a few issues that you need to be concerned with. One, as everywhere else, the inflation in cost of people